Good morning, Portland Chess Shop here to bring you the chess action, and we have round number 4 for the United States Chess Championships 2012, and Grandmaster Kaidanov is playing white against Kamsky in the featured match. Some of the other matches, I'll just give you a quick heads up on what happened. So, Sirouan played against Ramirez. Sirouan beat Ramirez. Shulman played against Strapinski. It was a draw. Onishuk and Nakamura drew. And Robson versus Hess, that was probably my favorite game of the match. That game was pretty exciting and had some pretty interesting positions, but I wanted to cover the Kaidanov versus Kamsky because I feel like it's the most important within the context of the entire championship. So Akopian versus Lenderman was a draw as well. And so let's jump right to it. So Kaidanov, he's obviously... I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he is an underdog against Kamsky. Kamsky being the second highest rated player in the United States. He was almost a contender for the World Championship this in 2012. He has a positional style, plays definitely different than Hikaru Nakamura, and he grinds people out in a positional fashion. So let's see how it goes, but he has the black pieces. It's always a struggle. So this is the Queen's Gambit. This is the beginning of the Slav. And the knight comes out. It's good to develop your knights towards the center. And so now both the knights out. And now black chooses between the semi-Slav and other things like the Slav. So he decides to play this. This is part of a Slav defense type structure. The idea is you want to take this pawn. You're threatening to take the pawn and then play b5. And you basically have to keep the pawn at that point. And so I think you make white play his pawn up, and then his bishop's trapped. I think that's the logic behind it. So that's why this move is played, to defend this square with the bishop. And now g6 is played, so there's a fianchetto planned, but it does take a couple moves to do that. So we'll see if white can get some activity. So the queen comes to b3 immediately, putting pressure here, and also putting pressure along this diagonal. And the queen is pretty strong in this position. It's basically pinning this bishop, not saying this bishop can't leave, because if this pawn was lost, it would be detrimental to the structure, for the black's pawn structure. So in this position, the queen is having some influence. You know, this bishop is trapped in, but this bishop, if it can come to this square and both go down this diagonal, then that's really good. Trying to go forward. Okay, so the bishop fianchettos and the knight comes up. Oh, sorry, the computer lagged. So the bishop comes up, the knight comes forward. The knight is obviously, as we talked about, really good in the center. It controls 56 squares within 2 turns. I do want to find out how many it controls within 3 turns. But yeah, knights are good in the center. So black castles, and the bishop comes to e2. It controls some squares and from here and allows castling, you know. So pawn up and bishop takes, and now this diagonal pretty strong. Even the knight is attacking this diagonal. So f7 is very weak, and it forces e6 to be played. Now this bishop is basically trapped in its own little base. It doesn't have many squares, while the white pieces have more mobility and more possibilities. So white castles, very good idea to castle. The queen comes to c7. This is probably the best square for the queen. It controls the h2 to b8 diagonal, as well as defends the b7 square. Bishop retreats. It's done its duty. It forced e6, and now it has some other ideas in mind. Maybe coming to f3 and then attacking down here, because this is one critical weakness in black's position. So the knight comes forward, attacking this knight. And now white might need to support it with f4 to overprotect that square. He does play that move. And now pawn up is played to attack at this pawn structure. Seems like a good move. And the bishop says, okay, well, I'm going to take the long diagonal. Oops, that's not the long diagonal. I think you know what I mean. Bishop takes the long diagonal, which is, you know, it controls... as we talked about, like 122 squares within 2 turns, if there's no other pieces, you know, in the way. I guess the knight always controls 56 within 2 turns, because it can, like, take here and then jump here no matter what. Like, I mean, obviously if you take it, But like if they're not taking your piece back, but the bishop can only go here. Huh. All right, that's interesting. But anyway, now a4 is played. It's defending. It's stopping b5, which would obviously liberate black's position. Black would have a lot more space, a lot more initiative at that point. So he does get in b5 anyway, but it looks like possibly we'll lose a pawn because it's 1, 2, 3 attacking with only 1, 2 defending. Takes, and yeah, see, the bishop comes out now. So this was a pawn sacrifice by black, and it's not 100% clear that it's a good pawn sacrifice because black can take here, take, and then take here, and now the queen, this pawn will be 2 squares away from queening. So takes, and this pawn is captured, which I think is interesting. I guess he didn't want to change his pawn structure to have an isolated pawn. Then he'd have 3 pawn islands, so now he only has 2. Now the queen comes here. The queen attacks the knight, and so the rook comes over to defend the knight, and now he captures with the pawn. It's defended twice, attacked twice, and it's a very strong and dangerous outside pawn. Knights are notoriously bad against outside pawns because knights have less possibilities when the knights are toward the edge, and the outside pass pawn will lead the knight to come towards the edge, and then it'll have less possible moves within multiple turns. So queen a7 is played, and now b4. This move is, that's what he's going for. He's going for b4, b5, overprotecting this, and it'll just be too good. So the knight retreats. You can see that Crafty likes the position. It's not completely over, but white's position is much better. Rook moves to a2. Bishop is doing its best to be active and pinning this pawn. Knight takes, and this knight comes to e4. Now it's trying to attack some of the dark squares that this bishop is no longer defending, or won't be defending. And this bishop wants to come over here, but it looks like this pawn could fall. So he does take with the rook, and the queen comes here. The queen controls a lot of squares in the center. One of my chess students told me that if a queen is in the center and there's no pieces on the board, the queen can move to 29 different squares in 1 turn. So I just can't even imagine how many it can move to in 2 turns, something that I'd like to calculate. Bishop moves to g7. Bishop moves to d2. Bishop retreats, and the rook comes over. I think white wants to trade off some of the weaker pieces. This rook wasn't doing very much. Well, these rooks are both pretty active, so he wants to trade one of these off. And when there's a few less pieces on the board, this pawn might be able to queen. I don't know. He needs to control the square in front of the pawn in order to advance the pawn. But pawns turn into queens, which is like really, really good. So I highly recommend that you try it. Knight comes here. I think this was forced. Otherwise, takes, and then I guess maybe not forced, but the knight doesn't look too active. It looks okay, but this knight comes forward. Now this is a really strong move because you're attacking the rook, and you can come here to attack the queen, which is exactly what you need to do. In order to turn a pawn into a queen, the best way to do it is to control the square in front of the pawn. You obviously need to control the square where the pawn is too, but it's important to control the square in front of it so that when the queen moves, you can advance this pawn and then try to advance it the whole way for touchdown. So the rook comes over, but knight b5 is still possible because after takes, then you take, and then you're threatening to go here and here with the knight. So the queen has to retreat, and now the queen retreats again. Knight comes to the center. And now the pawn advances again. The pawn is going for a touchdown. Rook is forced to move. I think the Kamsky's doing a good job of defending, but his position is weak. It's not good enough. So he'll have a lot of trouble trying to draw this game. But that's definitely his goal. So a few moves are made. A pair of rooks are traded off. And now white creates a little bit of luft for the king. He's not really in a hurry to turn this pawn into a queen. He knows it with the pawn right here and the queen right here. Black doesn't have very much activity. So the knight is attacked, and then the rook comes up, controlling 2 key squares. This pawn is obviously overprotected. It's defended twice, attacked once, which is definitely highly recommended. Overprotect key squares. So the rook wants to trade. The rook comes forward because he has to take back with the bishop. He can't take back with the queen because then this pawn is too likely to be able to advance. Now the pawn does fall. The bishop goes like this. Oops, not like that. And takes this pawn. And but the thing is this bishop takes back that pawn, and now white is up a piece. So, but the knight does win a pawn, but it's still just too good for white. So the white pieces start to go towards the action, because obviously the action is all in this in this general direction. So the queen retreats. The queen that's just in an attempt to centralize itself. It has the most possibilities within multiple moves when it's centralized. The queen tries to get some activity, play for maybe a trick or so, but this queen comes down and says, okay, let's trade. The queens are traded off, and then the king tries to come over here to maybe get some activity, try to push some pawns, try to create a position in which somehow it's a draw. But the bishop comes here, and now you see that these 2 squares are controlled by the knight. This square is controlled by the bishop. This pawn is attacked. It can't be defended by this knight. The only way to defend it is to play king here, after which knight check, king comes back, and then knight takes pawn, and then black is down a piece. Black's king is right here. If the king moves here, you just retreat the bishop, and you've already won this pawn. So it's just going to be a cleanup phase. You can take them all out. So that's the end of this game, which I thought was of importance for the match because Kamsky was the second most likely person to win this tournament after Hikaru Nakamura, and Kamsky has now lost with the black pieces. And Kaidanov, who is one of the few players that's not over 2,600, so he is actually tied for first with Hikaru. So I think it's pretty exciting. There'll be another round starting today, May 12th at 11 a.m. There's pretty good live commentary on the web at like uschess.com/live. If you can thumbs up this video, I really, really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. Thanks for watching. See you next time.